Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes you come across source material that tries to connect maybe two fields of study. Well, today we're tackling something significantly bigger, a source that genuinely attempts to connect everything. We're talking about the Unified Coherence Theory, UCT, presented by Philip Lillian.
It really is an enormous undertaking.
Yeah.
No hyperbole there. UCT isn't just presented as like a description of physical laws. It's framed as a blueprint for how the universe self-generates. It claims to synthesize fields that are usually miles apart, the messiness of fluid dynamics, the precision of complex analysis, and even fundamental ontology, the nature of being itself.
Right, that scope alone just demands a closer look, doesn't it? So our mission today is really to synthesize this framework. We need to tackle its three core, pretty audacious claims. You can almost think of it like a pyramid of difficulty. We'll start with the physical stuff, the pi phase law, which completely redefines turbulence. Then we move up to the metaphysical, this idea of coherence as maybe a fifth dimension of time and reality. And finally, the summit, the most philosophical part, a generative ontology that argues it moves beyond the limits set by Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Exactly. And if we're really going to dive deep here, we can't just treat this as, abstract speculation. Lillian's proposal is incredibly specific. It demanded we grapple with exact numerical details, these coordinate translation mechanics, specific formula components. Like you said, it defines turbulence not as chaos, but as a specific mathematically quantifiable form of order. And it bases the flow of time itself on a measurable gradient of coherence.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. We're basically charting a course from, say, how a stream flows right into the bedrock of logic itself. This is where it gets really interesting for you, the listener, because if UCT actually holds water, then the laws governing the quantum world, the physical world we see, and even the conceptual world, they might all be dictated by the same kind of hidden architecture.
And to really get the full scope, we have to treat this almost like a translation layer. We need to understand the source material UCT builds on. There's this external theory called scale-time dynamics, STD, before we can really appreciate how UCT's coordinate shifts attempt to redefine geometry, reality, and causality.
Right, context is key. Okay, let's start with that first pillar, the physical claim. Let's start with the claim that feels maybe the most physically grounded, but is still conceptually, well, pretty surprising, the pi phase law. When most people, certainly physicists, think about turbulence, the swirling, messy flow of a river or smoke rising, they think of the limits of our classical understanding. It's chaos, right? A breakdown of order. Something we struggle to model accurately, even with things like the Navier-Stokes equations.
That traditional view is foundational, yeah.
Yeah.
Turbulence equals disorder, unpredictability. It's where our nice linear equations tend to fail. But UCT just flips that entirely on its head. It redefines turbulence not as a loss of order, but as a state of self-referential coherence resonance. Lillian calls it internalized coherence.
Internalized coherence. So instead of the flow just losing its smooth, ordered path, it's like it's finding a more complex, self-interacting form of order, almost like a kind of dynamic fractal pattern expressing itself.
Exactly that. The transition isn't from order to chaos. It's from, let's say, extrinsic smoothness, what we call laminar flow, to intrinsic self-interacting curvature resonance. And the crucial point here is the mathematics. The flow doesn't just curve randomly. It curls back on itself in a very specific way that resonates with a universal mathematical constant.
Okay, and this brings us to the core governing parameter. How does UCT actually quantify this transition, this move from smooth flow to self-interacting complexity?
It introduces something called the coherence curvature parameter, CAPAC.
Not bad.
Physically, you can think of a CAPAC as the ratio between inertial deformation rates, basically how much the flow wants to curve because of its own momentum, and the viscous deformation rates, how much it resists curving because of internal friction or stickiness. And this is all defined within the Navier-Stokes framework.
So CAPAC is measuring like the flow's tendency to curl up versus its own internal resistance?
Pretty much, yeah.
That seems like a reasonable way to quantify instability generally. But the claim isn't just that instability reaches some critical level. It's that this level is tied directly, specifically, to pi.
Precisely. That's the core assertion. Turbulence begins not just at some arbitrary Reynolds number, but specifically when this coherence curvature parameter approaches pi. CAPAC write R of P out. This is what they call the critical pi phase threshold.
That is quite an assertion, mathematically. By setting the critical transition point for fluid dynamics at pi, UCT is explicitly linking hydrodynamics to, well, the most fundamental identities in complex analysis. You're talking about the Eulerian pi rotation in phase space, the one in e pi plus 1 equals all Laguerre.
Yes, that's the unifying step. Lillian claims that the Navier-Stokes transition happening in dimensional space, the actual physical swirling of water, and the Eulerian identity happening in abstract phase space, a coherent rotation leading to zero. He claims they are simply two projections of the same underlying ontological event.
The same event.
The physical act of the fluid self-inverting is seen as the manifestation of that coherent, phase-closed loop described by Euler's formula.
Okay, let's just pause on the audacity of that for a second. It elevates pi from just a geometric constant, circles and spheres, to a constant that governs the stability of matter itself. But where UCT really seems to differentiate itself is the numerical specificity that comes next. This transition doesn't just happen. It supposedly results in a quantifiable dimensional surplus.
That's the key testable claim, absolutely. At that critical threshold, drARO pi, the flow acquires a fractional dimensional coherence surplus. And the value is given as exactly pi minus 3, which calculates out to about 0.14159.
A fractional dimension, meaning the flow is effectively occupying slightly more than the three spatial dimensions we usually think of, indicating its path complexity is maybe fractal or infinite in some sense.
Right. It results in an effective fractal dimension, turbo-2, or approximately 3.15. That extra 0.15. That's the mathematical signature of the flow becoming self-referential, internalizing its own coherence.
Can we detail the actual formula they use for this? How do they model it?
Sure. The effective dimensionality of DC data is defined as dCt plus pi 3. So essentially you take the base physical dimension, 3. Then you add this specific coherence surplus, pi minus 3. But that surplus is weighted by the system's proximity to the critical transition point, represented by Timokana. Right at the onset of turbulence, when the Reynolds number hits the critical Reynolds number, that Cubicondra term effectively becomes 1. So you get d with c plus pi 3 times the 1, which is approximately 3.14.
Now, okay, here's where we need to maybe apply some constructive skepticism. I mean, this is a massive claim. If this fractional dimension is real, it has to have some measurable physical impact, right? Is this dimensional surplus just theoretical math, or is it linked to something concrete, like energy?
It is claimed to be linked directly to measurable energy. UCT actually modifies Kolmogoro's energy dissipation law. That's the standard way we calculate how energy is lost or cascades down in turbulent flows. UCT modifies it to account for this extra, let's call it curvature energy. The hypothesis is that this dimensional surplus of 0.14 must manifest as a measurable energetic difference.
And what is the specific prediction then?
By comparing the energy dissipation rate you'd calculate for this fractal dimension, DC ham-prox, 3.14 ham, versus the standard calculation for D3, UCT predicts, get this, a 4.7% curvature energy surplus right at that pi phase threshold. Calculation is straightforward. The ratio of the dissipation rates, epsilon is approximately $3.14, which comes out to about 1.047.
A 4.7% enhancement. Okay, that definitely shifts this from just being a neat philosophical connection to something potentially empirically testable. And Lillian claims this 4.7% surplus is consistent with observations.
That's the claim. Consistent with what has been observed in some real-world fluid dynamic experiments, specifically looking at enhanced energy transfer rates right around that critical transition point.
If that empirical consistency holds up under scrutiny, that would be significant validation for the UCT mechanism. It would suggest that the extra 4.7% energy isn't just being lost to friction in the usual way. It's being consumed by the act of the flow structuring itself, the formation of that 0.14 dimensional surplus.
Exactly. It's like the energy cost of generating localized coherence.
Which makes the distinction between the different layers of reality that UCT posits quite crucial, doesn't it? Because the claim isn't just about water flowing in a pipe. It's meant to be about the universe's fundamental structure. Lillian lays out this four-layer structure.
Yes, the omnilectic, the hololectic, the relational, and the derived. And we probably need to quickly understand the functional difference between them.
Right. What are those functions, briefly?
Okay, so the omnilectic layer, that's presented as the ultimate source, the absolute unity, undifferentiated potential. The hololectic layer is like the blueprint. It's the phase curvature potential field where that fundamental Euler rotation, initial pi phase turn, actually occurs. It holds the potential structure. Then the relational layer acts as a mediator. It translates that potential into observable laws and relationships. And finally, the derived layer is the physical, observable reality we interact with, the world of phenomena.
So turbulence, the thing we just discussed, where does that sit in this hierarchy?
Turbulence is considered the derived manifestation, the physical outcome of a coherence inversion that fundamentally originates much deeper at the hololectic phase curvature layer. So the hololectic layer dictates the rule, the Kappa right arrow pi condition. The drive layer displays the flow with that deopiling 3.144 dimension.
Okay. And the grand claim wrapping up this whole first section, it's that this pi phase threshold isn't unique to fluids. It's proposed as a universal coherence constant, governing transitions across all sorts of systems, physical, biological, maybe even cognitive. Anywhere a smooth continuum becomes self-interacting and finds some kind of localized self-referential order.
That's the assertion. It's presented as the universal law of complexity generation, whether it's the onset of instability in a fluid, or maybe the complex folding of a protein, or even the critical mass of connections firing in a neural network that might lead to conscious thought. UCT asserts the underlying coherence mechanism is always governed by that critical curvature parameter approaching pi. Okay, so moving up that pyramid of difficulty we mentioned, we now need to shift gears a bit. From the physics of, say, water to the metaphysics of existence itself. How does UCT take this core idea of coherence and weave it into the fundamental structure of reality and time? It achieves this through what it calls a crucial translation layer, and this involves integrating and reinterpreting an external theory, scale-time dynamics, or STD.
Right. For listeners who might not be familiar with STD, what was its basic idea and why did UCT feel the need to sort of refine or reinterpret it?
Well, STD was a really fascinating model in its own right. It tried to unify physics across different scales from the very small to the very large by introducing a dimensionless scale coordinate, usually called sigma, sigma Joller. And this sigma guard behaves somewhat like a fifth dimension.
Yeah.
The core concept was that fundamental constants, maybe even physical laws, might actually vary depending on the scale you're observing at. But a common critique, or maybe just a conceptual hurdle, was that sigma often felt a bit too much like just another arbitrary spatial coordinate. It complicated the geometry, perhaps, without providing a clear ontological meaning. What was this fifth dimension, really?
I see. So UCT is essentially stepping in, using STD's mathematical framework, but giving that extra dimension a new identity, providing the missing meaning, so to speak.
Yeah.
How does UCT recast STD's fifth dimension, then?
UCT performs what it calls a critical coordinate shift. It translates STD's scale coordinate, sigma, into its own intrinsic coherence coordinate, which it calls zeta.
Zeta, okay. And that distinction sounds quite profound. If it's not a spatial dimension we can move through, what is it? You said a measure of quality or density?
Precisely. Zeta represents a gradient of informational density or coherence.
Yeah.
It fundamentally moves away from being just another spatial axis. You can see this shift reflected right in the fundamental equations of motion, like the line element, He 2000, 2000, SES T2 STD's 5D line element included a term for changes in scale, like sigma 2000. UCT's coherent spacetime form replaces that with a zeta-2 term. But crucially, this new term isn't just sitting there. It's governed by something called a coherence radius, L Sellers, and it's warped by a coherence factor, which is a function of zeta itself plus theta 2. So the geometry of reality, according to UCT, is literally warped by how coherent or informationally dense the field is at that point.
Wow. Okay, so coherence isn't just some abstract philosophical concept here. It's being proposed as a physically measurable coordinate that actually dictates spacetime geometry. And if coherence is a gradient, as you said, how does this gradient then define the progression of time, the arrow of time we experience?
This is really the core of UCT's temporal model. The progression of time, the flow from future through the present into the past, is mapped directly onto a decrease in this coherence parameter. Time moves forward because, and as, coherence dissipates or reduces within a system.
So the past, in this view, is simply the most highly decohered state, the most stable because its information is maximally reduced or collapsed.
Correct. It's the state where potential has been resolved into actuality, maximally reduced information content. And this whole reduction process is governed by a specific metric, the coherence reduction rate, which they denote as gamma. UCT then provides quite rigorous definitions for the different temporal states. Future, present, past, based on the relationship between this reduction rate gamma and the natural frequency or oscillation rate of the system itself, which they call omega.
Omega. Okay, let's definitely detail these temporal states because this framework is essentially trying to define the boundaries of our conscious experience, isn't it? What does UCT mean by the future, specifically?
The future is defined as the realm of hypercoherent potential. It's a domain of pre-actualized states. Mathematically, this is the condition where the reduction rate is significantly less than the system's frequency, gamma omega. Because significant reduction hasn't happened yet, the potential is maximal. All possible states exist simultaneously, effectively in a superposition. It's pure potential.
Right. Pure, untapped potential. Highly coherent, but essentially undefined, indeterminate.
Okay. And the present. where we seem to live.
The present is described as the interface meta-operator zone. This is the active reduction zone. It's conceived as this thin dynamic layer where observation, consciousness, maybe even choice actually occur. Mathematically, it's the critical zone where the reduction rate approximately equals the system frequency, gamma approx omega. This balance point is crucial. It's where coherence is actively being reduced, collapsed into the definite classical reality we perceive.
And then the past, the record field.
The past is termed the Einselected record field. Einselection is a concept from quantum decoherence theory, referring to how preferred stable states emerge. So the past is the collection of these stable, decohered, effectively deterministic records. Mathematically, this is where the reduction rate has overwhelmingly dominated the system frequency. Information is locked in place, fully collapsed, stable, permanent. That gives almost a chilling structure to our reality. It suggests the very experience of now, the present moment, is literally the active site where potential coherence is being transformed irreversibly into history. There was also a specific note in the source about the location of life or awareness within this gradient.
Yes, that's right. Lillian makes a specific point, noting that the mathematical location of the golden ratio within the coherent symmetry structure aligns exactly with this present, this meta-operator zone where gamma approx omega. And this alignment is used in the text to validate the claim that life and awareness naturally occupy this balanced dynamic region. We exist, or perhaps emerge, precisely at the interface between potential coherence and history, decoherence. We are, in this view, the entities that navigate, or maybe even are, the process of active reduction.
Okay, if the present is the zone of active reduction, then this framework absolutely must have something to say about the quantum measurement problem, the central mystery in quantum mechanics. Why does this probabilistic wave function collapse into just one single definite state when we observe it?
That is indeed a crucial claim of the theory. UCT proposes that this coherence gradient provides a natural internal mechanism for resolving the measurement problem. It aims to eliminate the need for some kind of external, conscious observer to trigger the collapse. The collapse is part of the temporal flow itself.
So how is the physical act of measurement translated into UCT's terms? How does it work?
Well, where the earlier theory, STV, used a more abstract concept of a sampling field, a chi field, UCT translates this into a discrete coherence collapse function. The collapse itself is then described as being executed by a specific mathematical operator. The stochastic reduction kernel, denoted math Cauchy, and this kernel, math Cauchy, acts upon a highly coherent potential state, which itself is generated by coherence, represented as math Cauchy.
Okay, let me see if I follow that. So the collapse isn't some weird, mysterious event triggered from outside. It's the expected consequence of a coherent state naturally entering the present zone, where gamma approx omega. And at that point, this reduction kernel, math Carl operates. It takes the multitude of possibilities inherent in the hypercoherent state and embeds one single reduced outcome into the past zone.
That's exactly the proposed mechanism. The system enters the present, gamma approx, as a superposition. A coherence generation operator structures the potential inherent in, say. Then, the stochastic reduction kernel, mathcar, actualizes one specific state out of all the possibilities. Let's call it mathcar it's recorded. And as soon as that state is actualized, it immediately transitions into the past condition, where gamma omega becoming part of the deterministic classical record field. It's presented as a structured, coherence-driven collapse, dictated intrinsically by the flow of time itself, defined as coherence reduction.
Wow. So if we connect this back to section 1, the same fundamental quality, coherence, that supposedly creates a self-referential flow in water when gamma call hits pi, is also the quality that defines the geometry of time and provides the mechanism by which quantum potential becomes concrete physical reality.
That's the claim. It aims to connect macrophysics, turbulence, metaphysics, time reality structure, and quantum mechanics measurement using this single underlying variable, zeta, representing coherence. It's the ultimate claim of unification, really.
Okay, we've climbed the first 2 levels of this conceptual pyramid. We've looked at UCT's claims about physical reality, turbulence, and then about temporal reality, time, and measurement. Now we reach the apex. This is arguably the most ambitious and certainly the most philosophically challenging claim, that the unified coherence theory constitutes a generative ontology that actually operates beyond the constraints of Gödel's famous incompleteness theorems.
Yeah, this is definitely high-stakes territory. Gödel's theorems, as you know, were landmark achievements. Gödel demonstrated quite rigorously that any sufficiently complex formal system, meaning one with fixed axioms, a structure that allows for recursive functions, and the capacity to express basic arithmetic will inevitably contain true statements that cannot be proven from within that system itself. There are inherent limits to formal proof. UCT acknowledges this entirely, but it argues that its evasion of these limits is structural. It claims it's not the type of system Gödel was talking about.
Okay, so let's clarify Gödel's domain then. His theorems apply strictly to what UCT calls syntactic closures. What does that mean?
Correct. Syntactic closures are systems defined by a fixed set of symbols, syntax, and fixed rules for manipulating those symbols, inference rules. Think of standard mathematics or logic systems. They're designed primarily for description and deduction within those fixed rules. Gödel proved the inherent limitations of such descriptive, deductive systems. UCT, by contrast, claims to be something different, a generative ontological engine, not primarily a descriptive formal system.
That distinction sounds absolutely vital. So UCT isn't trying to describe the final architecture of reality using fixed axioms. It's attempting to model the engine that creates or generates that architecture in the first place.
Precisely. That's the core of the argument. UCT proposes that it generates formal systems, including arithmetic and logic themselves, as emergent lower-level projections or outputs. Therefore, it positions itself as being metaformal. It operates at a level above or before the formal systems Gödel analyzed. So if you think of the Gödelian limit as the ultimate horizon for any self-consistent formalism, UCT claims to exist beyond that horizon in a realm where generation, not description, is primary.
But doesn't this start to verge on just philosophical hand-waving or maybe even numerology? How can any system claim to operate without some kind of foundational axioms or starting points? Where does it begin?
That is absolutely the challenge Lillian faces, and the theory attempts to address it directly. UCT's foundation is explicitly stated not to be a set of logical axioms in the traditional sense. Instead, its base is what's termed the irreducible seed equation. Examples given in the source include things like I log plus 1 equals to pi log. Now, these equations are not presented as theorems derived within the system. They are described as, well, as irreducible, autocausal, and oncontically self-existent primordial conditions. They are the starting point.
So they're the genesis, not derived, just given or self-creating.
They are presented as axiomless in the sense that they aren't assumptions within a logical framework. They are proposed as the source of the framework. The argument then goes, the constraints Gödel identified apply to formalized arithmetic systems. But if the seed equation is the source that generates arithmetic and logic as its substrate, then the logic derived from that substrate cannot be used to constrain the source itself. You can't use the rules of the game to limit the thing that created the game board and the rules in the first place.
That is a very subtle but potentially critical philosophical maneuver. It shifts the entire starting point of the discussion about foundational limits. But okay, what happens then when a formal system derived from UCT down the line inevitably runs into its own unprovable Gödelian sentence? That paradox doesn't just vanish, surely.
No, it doesn't vanish, and UCT needs a mechanism to handle it. That's where the concept of the meta-Gödelian resolver comes in. This is embodied by what Lillian calls the orchestrating operator, or OO. This OO is described as essential for the system's proposed dynamic self-consistency.
An orchestrating operator. How does this OO resolve a sentence that, by Gödel's proof, cannot be resolved according to the rules of its own system?
Well, the limitation they encounter with the Gödelian paradox doesn't result in a logical dead end or system failure, according to UCT. Instead, it triggers a kind of generative recursion. The OO acts to elevate the system itself to a higher coherence layer.
Okay, let me try an analogy. Think of it like a computer program. Maybe program A, Gödel says, you can write program A so well that it will eventually formulate a true statement about itself that it cannot prove using its own code. Is the OO like saying, okay, program A hit its limit, we don't try to force the proof inside A. Instead, we use the fact that A failed as the necessary input to compile a new, higher-level operating system, let's call it program B, where the truth that was unprovable in A is now just an observable functional reality or a built-in feature.
That's an excellent analogy, yes. Yeah. At this newly generated higher coherence layer, the previously unprovable statement becomes, in UCT's terms, manifest rather than deduced. It creates this dynamic hierarchical process of self-explanation through ongoing generation. The system achieves consistency not through static logical completion within one level, which Gödel showed is impossible, but through a dynamic continual process of self-generation and level shifting.
Which implies that incompleteness itself isn't some kind of logical flaw or a sign of failure for the universe. UCT actually reframes it as the necessary engine for novelty and creativity.
Exactly. It's reinterpreted as a fundamental and crucially necessary asymmetry. UCT translates this Gödelian incompleteness into its own framework as the unprojected coherence remainder, which is denoted as Gödel.
The unprojected coherence remainder, that sounds like the leftover potential, the fuel for evolution, maybe.
Precisely. UL is framed as the negentropic potential, the reservoir of inherent creativity and possibility that enables genuine novelty, biological evolution, consciousness itself to emerge. The very limitation inherent in any descriptive system at a given level is what forces the system, via the OL, to generate the next more coherent layer of reality where that limitation is transcended.
So the deep underlying principle here is that the universe doesn't strive for, or maybe even allow for, a single, static, perfect, complete description of itself. Instead, it maintains what UCT calls a law of conservation of generative openness. It must always leave room for the next step.
Exactly. The theory encapsulates this with a really powerful, almost paradoxical statement. Every complete description is incomplete as generation. Every incompleteness is complete as potential. That unprovable Gödel sentence isn't a logical dead end. It's simply the signal that the next higher coherence layer is awaiting manifestation. The apparent failure of descriptive logic at one level becomes the driving success of generative ontology overall.
Which ties back beautifully, in a way, to Section 1's finding, doesn't it? That self-interaction and recursion seen physically in turbulence with DOTC approx 3.146 are fundamentally mechanisms of creation and complexification, not degradation or chaos.
Yes. The universal constant pi, which describes how a fluid system begins to self-interact and internalize coherence, is therefore suggested to be deeply related to the same necessary irreducible asymmetry that prevents the universe's logic from becoming a closed, static, and ultimately sterile system. Incompleteness is potential. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, that was an incredibly intense deep dive into Philip Lillian's Unified Coherence Theory. Let's try and bring these huge, complex claims back into focus for you, the listener. We can do that by just quickly reviewing the three core pillars that really structure this entire framework.
Okay. Pillar 1 was the pi phase law. This radically redefines turbulence not as chaos, but as a state of internalized coherence, governed by the universal constant pi. This specific curvature, cap-back right arrow pi, is claimed to lead to a testable dimensional surplus of pi minus 3, or about 0.14. And this corresponds to a predicted 4.7% energetic amplification in the flow, directly challenging the traditional view of turbulence as simply dissipative chaos.
Right. Then, Pillar 2, the comprehensive redefinition of time and reality. UCT takes STD's abstract scale factor and translates it into this intrinsic coherence coordinate, zeta. Zeta effectively acts as the fifth dimension, but it's a gradient of informational density, not space. And this gradient dictates the arrow of time itself, mapping future high coherence, gamma omega, present active reduction, gamma approx omega, and past decohered record, gamma omega, onto specific coherence reduction rates. And crucially, it provides a proposed physical mechanism involving that math-calc kernel for resolving the quantum measurement problem internally.
And finally, Pillar 3, the most radical proposition, a generative ontology. By claiming to be metaformal, operating before standard logic, and being built upon axiomless irreducible seed equations, UCT asserts it can evade Gödelian limits. It proposes to resolve logical paradoxes dynamically, using this orchestrating operator, OO, to elevate the system to a higher coherence layer whenever incompleteness is encountered. And this reframes incompleteness not as a flaw, but as the engine of creation, that unprojected coherence remainder, $1.
So when you step back, what does this all really mean? I mean, the sheer depth of the attempted integration is just remarkable. You have a single theory trying to link fundamental mathematics constants like pi, Euler's identity with large-scale messy physics like fluid dynamics, and then connecting that to the ultimate philosophical limits of logic and proof with Gödel's theorems, all into one self-generating, supposedly cohesive framework.
Yeah, it implies or suggests that maybe every time you witness a coherence threshold being crossed, whether it's water starting to boil and becoming turbulent, or the incredible complexity that allows light to interact with photoreceptors in an eyeball leading to sight, UCT suggests the underlying generative impulse might be fundamentally the same, driven by this intrinsic need for a system to achieve higher, more complex self-interacting order, possibly governed by that same pi constant.
And maybe here's a final provocative thought, something for you to explore on your own, building on the source material. If the universe's consistency, its ability to keep going and making sense, is maintained not by achieving some final, static, perfect logical description of itself, which Gödel suggests might be impossible anyway, but by the continuous dynamic act of self-generation, as UCT claims, then perhaps the greatest mystery isn't just what the universe is, fundamentally, but how it keeps generating the conditions necessary to explain itself, layer after layer. If pi really does govern all these transitions, maybe consider that every time you learn something genuinely new, something that clicks and reorganizes your understanding. Perhaps you're experiencing your own small, localized coherence inversion, governed by that very same universal constant.